Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Getting down to business, Russia's words match its actions. There is growing evidence terrorist groups in Syria have taken a real battering from Russia's air power. The West, particularly the United States, remains at a loss how to react. In the meantime, Russia creates political facts on the ground. To CrossTalk Syria, I'm joined by my guest, Eric Draitser in New York. He is a geopolitical analyst and founder of the website stopimperialism.org. We also have Fleitz in Washington. He's a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy, and he's also a former CIA analyst. And in London, we cross to Jonathan Steele. He's an international affairs commentator for The Guardian. All right, gentlemen, you've been on the program before. CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Eric, if I can go to you in New York, it's almost 2 weeks now. Official Washington is still seething with anger about Russia's enhanced and invited intervention in Syria. How is Washington reacting? Because I keep looking at the different sources and different individuals. It seems like just more muddle.
Well, to some degree, that's true, but I think that the political dividing lines in Washington have become ever more clear since Russia took this action, namely that the neocon establishment, those who have been arguing for a more muscle flexing, a more direct intervention on the part of the United States, they're, of course, blaming Obama. They're throwing Obama under the bus even more so. They're basically saying that it is Obama's failure in terms of policy that has allowed this. Of course, the question then remains, would it have been the war in 2013 under false pretext that they wanted? Would it have been arming of al-Qaeda through the al-Nusra Front and these other groups? Would it have been the Brookings Institution deconstructing Syria model, where they basically carve up the country into little statelets to be controlled by these various factions? There's a number of different strategies that have been put forward by various elements in Washington, including, astoundingly, former CIA Director and General David Petraeus, who argued for arming al-Qaeda in front of Congress. That was his argument. And so all of these various positions that have been articulated in Washington, all of them are really sort of doing battle in the court of public opinion, including what we've seen just in the last few days here over the weekend, the Washington Post op-ed, where they basically are arguing for establishing a no-fly zone and a quote-unquote safe haven in northern Syria. But I would ask all of these people, if I had the opportunity to speak to them, what exactly they think that would translate to, because a safe haven in Islamic State-controlled territory is a de facto safe haven for the Islamic State and for terrorism. And so if they're arguing that the United States should be siding with terrorism against Russia and against a legitimate government of Syria, I would say they are insane.
Yeah, but Fred, if I can go to you, but that's what it looks like it's getting down to. And that's why I'm actually in a real quandary here, because, I mean, if we're all supposed to be against terrorism and fight terrorists, why don't we do it collectively? And official Washington will have nothing to do with it. Go ahead, Fred.
I think I'm with you, Peter. I want to say I disagree, but I understand President Putin's decision to intervene in Syria. I disagree because I think what Putin is doing is going to increase the threat from ISIS and will be destabilizing. But I understand why he did this. There's a power vacuum in the Middle East because of President Obama's policies. Putin is filling that power vacuum. But more importantly, Putin is exercising decisive leadership. I hate to say that. I don't like this intervention by President Putin, but he's doing something that our president has been unable to do throughout his presidency, demonstrate decisive global leadership. I think the end result for Russia will be calamitous, because I think this will increase the threat of ISIS. It will lead to more ISIS fighters going back to Russia. And I think that's why it's essential that we really need dialogue between Russia and Europe and the West to find a better solution to this other than what's happening right now in Syria. Okay,
Fred, and if I can just the tail end of that, or maybe just destroy ISIS, because it seems to me ever since its inception, the West has been coddling it and trying to control it. I mean, 20,000 bombs, and they've done what? And ISIS has just increased its power. And Russia's been bombing for a little over a week, and some estimates, and I'm not going to say they're engraved in stone here, 40% of infrastructure. At least I've come across that against from informed sources. but I can't get a confirmation of it. So, maybe destroy this terrorist group instead of talking about it endlessly, and that's what they do in Washington. Jonathan, I go to you. You were in Syria recently. First of all, can you give us your impression and tell also what you think Russia's policy, how it will change the facts on the ground? Go ahead.
Well, I was in northern Syria, in a region which is controlled now by Kurdish militias. The Assad forces withdrew 3 years ago, and the Kurds have now taken over. And they've done extremely well against IS. They've liberated the town of Kobani, you remember, right on the Turkish border in December. In July, they liberated another crossing point from Turkey called Tal Abyad. So IS now only has 2 out of the 3 crossing points it used to have to bring fighters and weapons and money down from Turkey into Syria. But the crucial thing about this bombing, and you're right to say the American bombing hasn't achieved too much. It has achieved something if there are boots on the ground. And in combination with the Kurdish forces, US bombing has been effective. But the trouble is that there are no Kurds, of course, in central Syria. The only boots on the ground that you can work with in central Syria is the Syrian army. And that is what Putin is now doing, using Syrian airplanes and Russian airplanes combined with boots on the ground from the Syrian army to make some advances. And that's what is really necessary. It's a pity that the US is not collaborating properly with the Russians and welcoming this input of Russian military power, because they are the only ones who are coordinating with the Syrian army. The Americans could have done it, but they chose not to because they said that means propping up Assad.
Okay, the legitimate government in Damascus.
Can I interject on that?
Go ahead, Erica, because, the thing is here is that what we have is that we have a failed policy here, and all I see in Washington is the usual suspects is doubling down on failure. Go ahead, Eric. Jump in.
Yeah, there's a couple of points here that need to be made, and I'll address that in a second. But what Jonathan just said is a very critical point that is often lost within this narrative, namely what is happening in northern Syria with the Kurds. And I would like to bring up the policy of the Turkish government, because the Turkish government, it has now been shown, it has come out publicly in Turkish courtrooms, it has come out in Turkish newspapers, that Turkey and Turkish intelligence, the MIT, has been collaborating with the al-Nusra Front and with some of the other jihadist elements and terrorists and so-called rebels inside of Syria, arming them, using Turkey as a transit point, training them at various bases, including the one near the NATO base at Incirlik. They have taken the initiative in bombing Kurdish positions in northern Syria, and they are one of the foremost advocates of the so-called safe haven humanitarian corridor policy on the Turkish-Syrian border in northern Syria. Now, what this means is that Turkey is an active participant in the war against Syria. And this is a very critical point that is almost never discussed, namely because Turkey is a NATO ally. And so when you're talking about these policies, what you have to understand is that there is an international war going on here. It is not simply Russia now providing air support to the Syrian military or the Assad government fighting against rebels. There is an international war being waged. And part of the reason why an international coalition such as what President Putin suggested is absolutely necessary is in order to find a solution to what is undoubtedly an internationally fomented war. We can go back to 2011 and 2012, the CIA working with the Muslim Brotherhood on the Syrian-Turkish border. We know that Reuters has reported it. Even Jonathan's paper over at The Guardian has reported this extensively. Collaboration between regional governments and terrorist elements inside of Syria. This fundamental point is what underlines the entire conflict in that country.
Okay, Fred, because it gets down to, there's a lot of details there that Eric gave, but essentially the U.S., it looks through the prism of good terrorists and bad terrorists. We have to get away from that narrative because this policy that has come out of the State Department and the White House is an utter failure, and it is actually counterproductive to what everyone else or some other actors want to do, particularly Russia in Syria and in the region in general. Go ahead, Fred.
Peter, this has never happened before. I think I agree with you on most of the points you're making today.
Well, I won't invite you again, okay? I won't invite you again. Go ahead.
Concerning what Eric just said, I agree with a lot of what he said because Turkey's agenda here is very suspect. They are not interested in fighting ISIS. They're interested in fighting Syrian Kurds. And that's something this administration has never been able to deal with. But let me raise another point, which I think is very important. I wrote in September 2014 in Newsmax, that the Obama administration conceded the civil war to Assad years ago. And I think that's more true now than it was in 2014, now that Assad has enhanced support from the Russian government, from Iran, and from Hezbollah. The United States needs a new policy. Just calling for Assad to step down is not a policy. It's basically leaving us in Washington spinning our wheels.
Yeah. Agreed. Jonathan, can you reflect upon that? Because I'm just dumbfounded on how Washington, once it says somebody has to go, they won't let up, okay? I mean, Russia has changed the calculus right here. A lot of things are changing right now. Why can't Washington adapt and say, hey, a new page has been turned in the Civil War, and we have a great opportunity, now to start winding it down. And that's a real possibility right now, but I don't see people in Washington reacting. They're reacting in the wrong way. Jonathan.
Well, the trouble is that Washington never asks the question, what happens if Assad steps down? They say he must go, he must go, he must go. But what happens if he must go, if he goes? And that's the question I was asking people in the Syrian Kurdish area. And they were all saying, you know, do we want IS to capture Damascus and Aleppo? That's far worse than Assad remaining in power. You know, they're no friends of Assad, but they have to ask that crucial policy question. It'd be wonderful yet, say, to wave a magic wand, somehow Assad disappears, somehow IS disappears simultaneously, but it's not going to happen. You have to prioritize. Who is the biggest threat? The biggest threat is undoubtedly IS, and that means that Assad is one of your allies in fighting IS.
Okay, Eric, 30 seconds before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Can I just...
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to challenge very quickly something that Fred is saying here. I think that he's making the argument that basically it is weakness that has caused this problem. It is weakness on the part of the United States. I would argue that it is a policy of supporting and arming and fomenting terrorism, just as they did in Libya against Gaddafi, using al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Akim Belhaj, who is now leading Islamic State in Libya. They've done the same thing in Syria, arming terrorists in order to achieve an agenda by proxy, using terrorism as a proxy force. That is such an insidious policy. We're going to
go to a short break here. I'm going to ask Fred to reply when we come back from the break. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with our team.
Air support will be carried out without participating in ground operations.
If you have two American citizens and one spends $5 million giving money to politicians and one doesn't, the first one has way more influence on our policy, and that's not the way democracy is supposed to work.
"40 years later, they are still haunted by the guilt.
All the choices I made, I had real problems accepting that I did this. How can I be...
They come back to the battlefield to say sorry.
Our air war was vicious and brutal and horribly traumatizing to the Vietnamese people.
To remember fallen brothers.
I see you day and night, oh my brother.
And to bury their stories.
We are here together in part to allow the past to come back to us. Stories of so much pain and loss as my brothers carry get buried in our own minds and hearts and souls because the pain is so immense.
Vietnam, the stories that haunt soldiers' hearts.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story or the person with the loudest voice or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
Some people ask more questions than the government wants them to.
How do we make decisions about how we want to vote? How do we make decisions about what kind of government we would like if we don't know what those governments are doing?
They are whistleblowers, and they want to know what is really going on.
It's extremely dangerous in America right now to be right as a whistleblower when the government is so wrong. So speaking truth to power is now a criminal act.
Whistleblowers are growing more dangerous than external threats.
And a dozen agents are streaming across my front yard. My life at that point was turned completely upside down.
They are seen as enemies of their own country.
We're at war with a bunch of people who want to hurt the United States of America. And for people to leak that program and for a newspaper to publish it does great harm to the United States of America.
What secrets make a government go to war with whistleblowers?
Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Russia's enhanced involvement in the Syrian crisis. Okay, Fred, I'd like to give you the opportunity to reply what we heard from Eric at the very end of the first part of the program. Go right ahead.
Well, I may be very critical of the Obama administration, but it does not want to arm terrorist groups. And now we know this train and equip program to train moderate Syrian rebels. One reason this program went so badly is because the administration was so fearful of providing training and weapons that could fall into the hands of terrorists. I think there might have been a better way to do this, but I do give them credit. I think they've been very cautious not to arm terrorists, and I don't think the Bush administration did this either. Well, I think there's just nothing to that argument.
Okay, but Fred, I mean, there is something to the point. I'll give it just a second here. There is something to the point where the Pentagon was very careful, at least we're told anyway, to vet people. The CIA gave weaponry and training and everything else to anybody that would take it to do their bidding for them. Okay, that's the difference there. And I think that those people that the CIA is continuing to. I mean, everyone says the Pentagon has given up. Yeah, well, maybe they have, but not the CIA. So I think there is a difference here. The CIA wasn't very.
True. That's not true.
No, I think there's a growing amount of evidence that is true, okay? And that's one of the unfortunate things here. And we also know that a great deal of the weaponry that has been given to whatever group is often or almost always falls in the hands of the wrong people, in the hands of ISIS. So I think it's pretty unanimous, a failure of unbelievable magnitude. And it's not just Obama; it's American foreign policy in general in the Middle East. That's what I would say. Jonathan, would you like to reply to anything that we've said here so far in the last few minutes? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I wanted to bring in a point about the no-fly zone that was mentioned at the beginning as what the neocons want. I mean, this is nonsense. First of all, it's slamming the door in the face of refugees. Basically, Turkey is saying, we don't want any more of these refugees to come in. We'll just tell them to sort of huddle close to the border somewhere inside Syria. They can't come across. And that's an absolute disgrace and a shame. People should be allowed to come across these borders and escape if they want to. That's the first point. The second thing is the no-fly zone is just it cannot be policed. It means bringing in American air power to confront any planes that penetrate the no-fly zone. So it's an absolute recipe for disaster. It's creating a new air war, air clashes between Russia and the United States over Syria. It would lead to, you know, unimaginable consequences if that happened.
Unfortunately, that's probably what some people want. Eric, you know, that's what's really interesting is that there is already a no-fly zone, and Russia controls it, okay, and patrols it, and that's on top of it. And that's why all this talk about a no-fly zone is absolutely ridiculous. It would take a United Nations Security Council resolution to do that, and we all know that Russia wouldn't vote for it. So, I mean, people just chasing their tail in Washington on this here. And also, I'd like to point out here, and Eric, this is a specific question to you. It seems to me that the Washington will double down, and what they'll do is to say, we won't train any people anymore officially, no more Pentagon stuff, but they'll double down and they'll give more and more arms, and what they want to do is turn it into a regional, not a Syrian civil war, but a regional civil war that they think they can manage. They always think they can manage it. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, that's right. And actually, the policy is going to essentially inflame conflict throughout the region because, of course, the more that Russia moves to destroy ISIS and on this front, the more that these terrorist groups are going to try to infiltrate into Jordan, infiltrate into Lebanon, reestablish their positions in Turkey, all throughout the region. And so if the regional powers and the international powers don't collaborate with Russia and the Syrian government, they are, in fact, complicit in spreading ISIS, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I want to make a couple of other points here. And Jonathan's paper over at The Guardian covered this story extensively, as did Arab media and a number of other outlets, namely that the weapons that have been supplied by the United States into the hands of these so-called moderates have almost always gone into the hands of ISIS. And on this front, oftentimes, right after they receive them, they simply move over and now call themselves the Islamic State or call themselves al-Nusra or ally themselves with the Islamic Army of Conquest or any of these other factions. So they present themselves as moderates and then immediately overnight become jihadis. My point here is there is very little distinction between these so-called names like moderate and terrorist. They are essentially all fighting the same war. And the idea that the United States is going to be able to make these delineations, this is for propagandistic reasons. If you read the Washington Post or the New York Times, they constantly hammer these points home. And I will never speak fondly of the Bush administration, but at the very least, the Bush administration didn't try to make distinctions between this terrorist group and that terrorist group. Everybody was a terrorist, clearly. And I think that that is what needs to be understood here. Moreover, U.S. policy in Syria is de facto fomenting and stoking this civil war. Rather than trying to find a peaceful solution, bringing the parties to the table, as Russia has demonstrated they want to do, coming back to Geneva, all of these things, the United States insists on regime change, a regime change scenario which is now clearly and unmistakably out of the question. And I would add one other point here. Who gave the United States the right to determine what is or is not a legitimate government in Syria? That right only belongs to the Syrian people. And no matter what you want to say about Obama's policies, Obama's strategic failures, or what have you, ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the Syrian people that have to decide that. And again, Putin has said that many times before, and he's right.
Okay, Fred, you want to respond to what Eric just said?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any point in arguing whether Assad should step down. That's not going to happen. So I'm not going to bother responding to those points. But concerning moderate Syrian rebels, this is an interesting point. It's hard being a moderate Syrian rebel in Syria because they're simply not getting adequate support from the United States and the West and the Gulf states.
They're
constantly being tempted and pressured to go to the other side.
Who are these people? I mean, like I've said before, it seems
there are Syrian rebels who are not Islamists, but the number is decreasing because the Islamists have the initiative and the weapons and the support. And that's why the moderate Syrian rebels are defecting and becoming part of this Islamist movement. And the United States hasn't done much to stop that.
Okay, well, it seems
to me... But the arms and support are coming from the same sources. They're coming from the U.S. and the Western powers anyway. So, I mean, the argument is moot because the weapons that go to the so-called moderates are the same weapons that go to the so-called Islamists. It's all coming from the same source. It's part of the same war.
Okay, Jonathan, these phantom moderates, did you come across any of them? Because, I turn on CNN and they're everywhere. They're all Jeffersonian Democrats, and John McCain knows them really well. But then in the real world, I don't see where they are. Did you see any? quote-unquote moderates when you were in Syria.
I talked to the Syrian Kurds about it, and they occasionally talk about some small Arab groups in villages, sort of local militias who are just basically sort of home guard defending their own village.
Yeah.
So there are one or two people like that who are not yet part of the Islamist groups, but they're completely insignificant in northern Syria. So I don't think that's really the question. The question is, should the US now be supporting the Syrian army? That's the crucial point. Instead of trying to denigrate what Putin is doing, shouldn't they say, look, we do want boots on the ground. We're not putting American troops on the ground. We're not putting Arab troops from abroad. We've got the Syrian army on the ground already. Why not help them to defeat ISIS? They're doing the best they can, and they're the best bet.
Okay. Eric, but that's
a reason why they won't do that.
That's too logical. That's too easy. That's too simple, and it would resolve things. I mean, you could bring these people to a table. We could get this taken care of, wind this down quickly. But no, the bad actors in the region, Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf countries, the United States, Israel, all the bad actors there, they don't want what happened, we heard from Jonathan in London. Go ahead, Eric.
That's right, because ultimately the agenda is geopolitical in nature. This has nothing to do with simply trying to find a solution. It's not even just about regime change in Syria. It is about a geopolitical agenda where they want to break the alliance that exists between Iran and now Iraq, Syria, and Hezbollah, the crescent of Shia power, the Shia alliance, which is not a purely sectarian one, but one that is strategic in nature. The United States wants to destroy that, and it wants its regional allies to help in destroying that. And part of the reason why they can't let go of this regime change scenario or regime change strategy is because they want to break that alliance. They want to sever Hezbollah from Iran. They want to carve up the region. And they understand the Islamic State and Sunni extremism, generally speaking, is the principal bulwark and principal vehicle by which they're able to achieve that strategy. And so it's deeply cynical. And quite frankly, this is the neo-colonial nature of what the U.S. and the Western powers are doing. It is very similar to what the British did at the height of their imperial dominance in the region. It is something that we have seen over the course of more than a century, the way that Western powers do this.
Okay, Fred, I mean, one of the most interesting things, I think there are two things here that are very interesting here when we look what's going on in the region. Russia was invited in to use air power to assist the regime in Damascus, all under international law. But the other thing that's really interesting is that we have Iraq, where the United States invaded illegally in 2003, and I'm going to give my narrative, occupied it, destroyed the country, and now it is aligned with Tehran and with Damascus, with Hezbollah, and maybe indirectly with Russia. I mean, who would have thought back in 2003 that would be the outcome of that conflict?
Well, I agree with Eric that this is geopolitical in nature, but I don't think the Obama administration's confused foreign policy could pursue anything as sophisticated as what he's promoting. What I believe is happening is Russia's not in Syria to fight terrorism. It is in Syria to start a new Russian-based regional axis with Iraq, Syria, and Iran to remove American influence from the region. And because there's a power vacuum. I think we can agree there's a power vacuum because of Obama administration policy. That's really what's going on here. I mean, I hear what Eric's arguments. They sound very good, but the enormous confusion of this administration, it's just not credible that Mr. Obama and his security team could possibly be pursuing a strategy like that.
Okay, I want to give Jonathan the last word. I want to give Jonathan the last word on the program. We're going to have to all come back again, gentlemen, all four of us here. But Jonathan, please tell us, please, give us a flavor. What are people talking about on the ground? We can theorize all we want, but you are a witness. Please tell us.
Well, they're basically saying that IS is the main threat, and they're worried. As I mentioned at the beginning, they pushed IS out of this large part of the Kurdish northern region, but IS still comes back with car bombs and suicide bombs and so on. They haven't been eliminated. They want to eliminate them. They don't have enough Kurdish troops to move into a largely Arab area like Raqqa. The only people who can do that are other Arabs, and that means the Syrian army. So they keep saying, look, you've got to choose. Who is the greater threat? Is it IS or is it Assad? And we think it's IS. I spoke to the leader, Saleh Muslim, the head of the PYD, the political leader of the Syrian Kurds, and we asked him directly that question. He said it would be a disaster for everyone if IS won this victory and the Assad regime collapsed. And I would have thought that's so blindingly obvious to everybody in Washington, Moscow, anywhere else who's looking at this thing. So why not then decide, if you've answered that question in a sensible way, so well, how are we going to make sure that IS doesn't win?
Okay.
You have to defeat them and
I think all of us agree on that point. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in New York, London, and Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.